Welcome to our presentation for the 44th International Conference on Software Engineering about the paper called Imperative versus Declarative Collection Processing, an RCT on the understandability of traditional loops versus the Stream API in Java. The paper was authored by Niels Mehlhorn and me, Stefan Hanenberg. So let's start with a quick overview of the results. First, we introduce a randomized control trial which compares loops and streams. The focus of this trial was on readability. The trial was executed on 20 participants. In the trial, 7 different queries were used. And the task for each query was to answer the question, what is the result of the query? The measurements that were done in the experiment were time correctness and the subjective rating of each participant. The main result was the Stream API had a strong and large positive effect on the response times. The loops required approximately 78% more time than the Stream API. The Stream API caused less errors than the loop version of the code. And participants perceived the Stream API as better in comparison to loops. Let's start with some background information about how we typically currently handle collections, especially from the imperative perspective. Let's use the following task as an example. We want to collect all adults from a person collection. So we want to store the adults in a new collection. If we do it using traditional loops, the code looks like the following, or typically looks like the following. First of all, we have the original person collection, and then we have a result declaration and definition. Then we have some explicit loop, which also contains some loop variable. And then we have certain filter criteria, which are typically expressed via if statements. And finally, we have some additional interaction with the result collection, such as just adding an element additionally to the result. So how does this code typically look like if we use the Stream API? Again, we want to collect the adults from a person collection. And we have, again, the person collection. And in the first step, we typically convert this collection into a stream. Then we apply a certain lambda expression as a filter criterion, and finally we specify how the result should be represented, for example, as a list. So what are the characteristics of the Stream API? The Stream API can be considered as a more modern form of collection handling, which is available since Java 8 or since 2013. The Stream API massively relies on lambda expressions, which can be considered as a more declarative kind of programming. It has some additional technical features which are not in the focus of the present presentation or the present paper. So the general question that we ask ourselves is, does it imply that the Stream API should be used or not? So do we have measurable benefits from it which are beyond the technical characteristics? And from our perspective, this question is not restricted to Java. We find other programming languages that evolved in a very similar way, where lambda expressions were introduced and where we find APIs in order to handle collections in a more declarative way. And here the question is also, is this the better way of handling collections? Well, before trying to answer this question, it makes sense to take a look into the related work on lambda expressions, because it turns out that the evidence for lambdas isn't that strong as we might expect, taking into account that today it is quite normal that imperative languages get more declarative features in terms of lambda expressions. In 2019, Lucas et al. Determined that about 50% of developers see an improvement in the introduction of lambdas in Java. So it could be an indicator that lambdas might be beneficial. And as a consequence, it also might be the case that the usage of lambda expressions in the Stream API is beneficial. In 2016, we find a more critical study with respect to lambda expressions, because Usberg et al. Found out that if we iterate collections either using lambda expressions or for loops, the participants had drawbacks using lambda expressions. So it required simply more time for them to do an iterating task. In 2017, we find somehow a comparable study by Salvaneschi, who found a benefit of reactive programming compared to the observer design pattern with respect to readability. And in a more recent publication, we compared the readability of lambda expressions in comparison to anonymous inner classes in Java. And what we find out is that lambda expressions had, for quite trivial tasks, some readability benefits. So what we conclude is we do not see a clear tendency towards benefits and drawbacks of lambda expressions, and from that we think it actually makes sense to run an additional study on that. So what is the actual research question that we try to answer? The question is, are queries defined using the Stream API more readable than the same queries using loops? And just to give an example, on the left-hand side, we see a certain loop. On the right-hand side, we see a comparable expression using the Stream API. And the general question is one more readable than the other? If we just see this example, we at least get the impression that the Stream API code is shorter, but it's unclear for us whether or not we can conclude from that it requires less time or it causes less errors. Our goal was to design an experiment, and what were some initial considerations that we had for this experiment? First of all, we intentionally wanted to build a within-subject design, and the reason for it is that we assumed that there might be a larger deviation between the participants. The second consideration, or major consideration that we had, was we had to take care somehow for the code complexity. So we think that if we have very, very trivial queries, we probably will not see any difference between loops or the Stream API. And because of that, we thought it makes sense to focus on grouping and mapping. And well, again, the query shouldn't be too trivial. On the other hand, they shouldn't be too complex, because too complex might also mean that a larger deviation between the subjects might appear. And finally, with respect to the code representation, we just wanted to have the most usual representation. So with respect to lambdas, for example, we used the lambdas without type declarations, and we used indentations for loops, etc. So which from our perspective represents the most usual way of writing code. So as part of the experimental design, we wrote an application where the measurements were performed and where the experiment was presented to the participants. And this is the URL where you can download the tool. And this is how the tool looked like. On the left-hand side, you see the input for a method that has been defined, and this method contained just this operation on the collection. On the right-hand side, you see the potential outputs, and it was the task of the participants to choose results from the list. So they had to click on each line, and at the end they had to confirm the choice. So what does it mean? So the moment when they confirmed the choice, this is the moment where we checked whether what time it required and whether or not the result was correct. After each task, we also asked additional questions to the participants, and I'm sorry, this is here written in German because the tool was written in German. And what these questions were, they were asked to give a number 1 to 10 for each question, and 1 means low and 10 means high. And the first question was, how good do you think you are in this task? And how fast do you think you were? And how appropriate do you consider the code that has been shown to you? And so after every task, we got responses of these 3 subjective perceptions of participants. And in the end, we just get a CVS file, and this is the CVS file that we could use for the statistical analysis. So in case you're interested in replicating the experiment, you can just use the tool, and what you have to do then is to use the results from the CVS file and analyze them using statistical methods. So how did our experimental layout look like? So first of all, what were the dependent variables? As we said, we have the response times that we measured in milliseconds. We have the correctness, which distinguished between true and false. And we had the subjective perception with respect to 3 different questions, each one scaled from 1 to 10. The independent variables were the technique, so which is either the loop or the stream API, and the group. So we had a group A or group B, and group E was the one where the people started with a loop. Group B was the group where people started with a stream API. After that came the other technique. So it is really just the question, what is the original first starting technique that you used? Then we had these 7 different tasks. And additionally, we had some fixed variables, so which were first of all the ordering of the tasks. So the subjects receive them in the appropriate order, or always in the same order, and the alternation of the techniques, so loop stream or stream loop, was always the same. So just to make sure, an independent variable is the group. And what we did is that each participant was randomly assigned to the groups that in the end, group A and group B had the same number of participants. How did we execute the experiment? As said, we had 20 volunteers, 10 master students, and 10 professional developers. Each one told us upfront that they were familiar already with the Stream API. And the choice was just based on purposive sampling, which means that we try to get those ones that were somehow available. We had individual sessions for each participant, so it means that we had a one-to-one situation between the experimenter and the participant. And in the beginning, we gave each participant some short tutorial, and we didn't follow a strict guideline how to do this tutorial. It was just some kind of reminder how certain methods look like in the Stream API, such as grouping, etc. It took up to 15 minutes for each participant, depending on whether or not the participant had additional questions, and we answered those questions within this time period for the tutorial. Additionally, participants were permitted to take breaks between 2 tasks and as they liked. So if they think they require some additional time between 2 tasks, then they were allowed to take it. So let's speak about the results with respect to reaction time and correctness. This is the interaction diagram showing for each task and for each technique the corresponding reaction time. And what we see here is for all tasks, the mean times are lower with the Stream API in comparison to the loop. But we also see that there are, depending on the tasks, larger differences between them. Expressed in a more statistical term, it turned out that technique was a significant factor, and the interaction between technique and the task was also a significant factor. The task itself was a significant factor. Group was not, so it didn't matter whether or not they started with the Stream API or with the loop. When we speak about those differences, we see that the mean loop time and the mean stream time, if we build the ratio of it, the result is 178%. So it means that loop took about 87% more time than the Stream API in average over all tasks. So what you can see here is that there are larger differences between each task. So there are certain tasks where the differences are relatively low, between just 123% up to 282%. Maybe we should mention that this 282%, it was a very special task that we just added for a certain purpose, but at that point, I would like just to refer to the paper to get a deeper understanding what the special meaning of task 6 was. We must make sure that even task 6, if we ignore it, doesn't have an influence on the results, so we still get significant results for technique and with a comparable ratio between the different techniques. So what we can say, we have a strong and a large effect. It depends on the task as well. And additionally, we ran a chi-square test in order to check whether there are differences in the errors. And what we found that more errors were done with the loops in comparison to the Stream API, which was more precisely 30 errors were done with the loops and 10 with the Stream API. So let's quickly speak about the subjective ratings. So as we said, we asked 3 different questions. The first one was the performance. The second was the assumption, how quick they were and how readable they considered the code. And what you can see in all situations, the loops were considered lower than the streams, which means that on average, participants considered the Stream API is more appropriate. And what you can see is that also differed from task to task. So there were tasks where they considered the Stream API much better than the loop, and other tasks where the differences were rather minor. So participants perceived differences in speed and readability, and as we said, difference in speed depend on the task. So let's quickly speak about the thread's validity. So typical things that we have to mention here is we have a relatively low sample size, we have very special kinds of tasks, and so on and so on. And I do not think it's necessary to speak about all these things in detail. A general question that people are concerned with is, are the results generalizable? And the honest answer to this question is we have absolutely no idea. So maybe it makes sense to be more precise with the question. So what exactly do we mean by generalizability? Do we think that we get the same results for a different sample, or does it mean that we can generalize over an arbitrary programming task or whatsoever? So I personally believe that we cannot make a serious statement about the generalizability of the results. So let's come to the summary and discussion. We built an experiment. We had 7 tasks, and we did the experiment on 20 participants, and it showed that loops were on average 78% slower and had more errors. We also showed that the results strongly depended on the programming task, but for the current situation, we don't feel aware how we could describe the kind of programming tasks in a more appropriate way, except that we can say, okay, the tasks were slightly different. So it seems that the Stream API has a positive effect on readability, and Our interpretation is that it means that the general introduction of declarative features might positively influence language design, at least from the readability perspective. So in order to conclude this work, within an experiment, Stream API seemed to be beneficial with respect to reading, and the effect is not small. But in general, we would rather say it would be very helpful if we would know more about Lambda expressions, Stream APIs, etc. So we personally would hope that we'll find many more experiments that end up with quantitative results that we can, in the end, compare somehow. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and in case you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop an email to us. Thank you very much.